We're good to go.
Good, af- Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nishant Sharma, a visiting researcher at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Institute for today's special event. Today's event will focus on the legacy and impact of Shinzo Abe. Abe's sudden and tragic demise has not only shocked the entire world, but also left questions open, such as which aspects of his legacy would be carried forward by his successors and in what form. This seminar will discuss Shinzo Abe's domestic, foreign, and security policy and how sustainable it will be in the future. Joining us today for this discussion are two distinguished speakers and an eminent chair. Our first speaker for the day is Chiharu Takinaka, a former professor of international politics at the Graduate School and College of Law and Politics, Rikyo University. Our second speaker is Rohan Mukherjee, an incoming assistant professor of international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. To chair this session, we have a distinguished career diplomat, Deepa Gopalan Vadva. She is a member of the governing council at ICS and has served as a former ambassador of India to Japan. You can find their extended bios in the link provided in the chat box. Now, before we proceed, some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the course of the event. Please pose your questions and comments via the chat box or the raise hand option during the Q&A session. Please unmute yourself only when called upon by the chair to do so. I will now hand over the proceedings to the chair. Please take over, ma'am.
Ma'am, you need to unmute yourself.
Ma'am, your voice is not audible.
Am I audible now? Okay. Thank you very much, Nishant, and thanks to Director Ambassador Shokant for this opportunity of chairing this very important session that we have on this webinar on the legacy and impact of Shinzo Abe. There have been several, I think, webinars and talks and on the subject of late, because I think it's just a shock that something like this could have happened. It was just about 2 years ago, I think, that we were talking about his legacy, but in another context that was not posthumous. We were talking of his legacy as he stepped down, and we didn't expect him to step down after 8 years as prime minister, and said, now what is the future going to hold? And I think the sense in the last 2 years, while he was not prime minister, but he still loomed very large on the political stage of Japan. So now we're really looking at a time beyond him, and what will be the impact, both in terms of domestic policies and in terms of the security and foreign policy that he put in place. We have two speakers. I think Nishant has introduced. I just want to say, by way of a little bit of introduction, that Professor Takanaka is somebody who knows India extremely well, and I knew her in Tokyo, and the joy of not having to explain India to her, because she knew it perhaps better than me. So she's been somebody who has followed India and knows the India-Japan relations extremely well too. So I'm really happy to have you with us, Professor Takanaka, and also I know that you're an author, of several books, including one on Mahatma Gandhi, which was released, I think, just prior to COVID. The second speaker, as we were told, is Dr. Rohan Mukherjee, and besides his, of course, the fact of him being now accepted as an academic on Asia of some sort of repute and renown, and is moving to the LSE. I really got to know him in the context of a very interesting book that he structured and compiled on India-Japan relations, and that was, I think, in 2016. And maybe it's time for an update, Rohan, that we look for an update on that. But it was really a go-to book for me. It was a kind of primer on various aspects of the India-Japan relationship, and it was called, for those who want to refer to it, it was called Deepening India-Japan Relations in the Asian Century. So Dr. Mukherjee, has been very advantageously located, I think, to look at foreign and strategic policy, and will be talking to us about which of these elements we can expect to kind of survive Prime Minister Abe. Now, just a very few words of introduction. I don't really want to take into time because I just said that of course, the world was completely shocked, as you can see, at the tributes that have poured in, because I think Prime Minister Abe was really the face of Japan for the last decade, for all of us, I mean, internationally. And I think he gave that element of stability domestically, which was extremely important. But also, there was another thing. He was an ideator. I mean, I know this word of, probably a newfangled word, but an ideator, because of the new kind of ideas that he put on the international foreign policy and strategic arena. For example, the Indo-Pacific. Now, most of the world accepts this, the Indo-Pacific, but as we all know that, he probably was progenitor in a way of that word, of the concept, the construct. And also of free and open Indo-Pacific, which may mean different things to different people with caveats. But on the other hand, the basic tenets hold. The Quad, which now is moving towards greater institutionalization. What I did find is that the obituaries that were there were those who called him an ultra-nationalist. I mean, not in a very positive way, particularly in the West. And also conservative. And I think, there are many dimensions to these issues. But I really saw, I was there for my 3 years there, Prime Minister Abe was there as Prime Minister. I saw him really as an internationalist, who wanted to sort of give back Japan's stature on the international stage, which he managed to do. And, besides, of course, the Indo-Pacific Quad and so on, but his commitment to trade agreements, I mean, regional trade agreements and FTAs. I mean, the CPTPP, RCEP, I think there was his hand behind it, as we all knew. I mean, he was quite a moving force. He also crisscrossed the globe, and this was something we used to watch when we were there, and he carried with him corporate Japan with him. And he also very strategically used ODA to further Japanese interests. So I think every country, every leader does work for their own interests, but I think in that way, he probably engaged much more with the world than had ever been known before, in a very different sort of fashion. Also, you heard the expanded, I think it was called the Expanded Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, which he propounded as a counter to the BRI. Interestingly, of course, at the end of it, he also joined the BRI, which is something we all try to figure out, but it was more, I think, as a carrot to put relations on track, Japan-China relations on track. The domestic politics, of course, he was known for his Abenomics, mixed report card. But I remember again something, there's some things that stick in, I think, our minds, and that was that the Nikkei moved from 8,000 to 24,000. So there were the positive aspects of what happened. And as I said, it was a mixed report card. But he also challenged many shibboleths. One of the things that we talk about most often is, of course, security policy, reinterpret, review the constitution. You have the National Security Council set up. You have a national security strategy that he talked about. But there were other areas also, which he ventured into. And here I remember really issues such as really shaking up corporate governance in a way by getting a larger say for the shareholders, or bringing in more diversity, talking more about immigration. But these are subjects not very easy to tackle in Japan, but he did so. So I think we will look at which one of these will survive. I think they're already there on the table, and I think they'll be taken forward in some form or the other. But our audience is predominantly Indian, I presume. And for India, he was extremely, extremely special. And I think Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar, he summed it up. There was a memorial meeting 2 days ago when he said he had a very, very unique role to play in the development of the relationship. And what he really did was not in defining and developing the relationship, but taking it forward at a much faster pace than otherwise would be the case. So I think, therefore, Prime Minister Abe for a long time to come will be, one of the most well-remembered and most, perhaps, if I can use the word, loved figure as far as Indians are concerned, for what he's done to India-Japan relations. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Professor Takanaka, for your presentation. Over to you, please.
Can you see my PowerPoint all right?
We can see and we can hear you too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I took some time to put this PowerPoint on the screen. Thank you very much for the kind and detailed introduction. And also thank you very much for the invitation to this special seminar on Japan, organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies. When Ambassador Wadua Deepa-san contacted me, I thought there are many more relevant people who can talk about Shinzo Abe's issues and his domestic politics and also international relations from Japan. But because she is a very, very good friend of me, eventually I said, yes, I will talk on this topic today. So I feel I shouldn't be here, but anyway, I will try my best to talk about this topic. As Wadua-san said, the assassination of our ex-Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was really shocking for Japanese people. Especially, it's very, very rare in Japan to have the political assassination and to lose somebody who served as a prime minister to the country. So actually, election campaign was really, peaceful, and even ex-prime minister Shinzo Abe was not very tightly guarded by the security and police. So you can imagine how shocking for many Japanese to see the scenery on that day. And the other, surprise for many Japanese is that we get lots of messages from the global leaders in many countries to say that our ex-prime minister was a really great political leader in the international society in this 21st century. So anyway, we came to think what kind of politics we had during his prime ministership and what kind of politics we are having, during these 2 decades. We are still a little bit perplexed to see the phenomena. And in fact, the general election just after this assassination was not totally affected by this event because it was already predicted that the ruling party, Liberal Democratic Party, would win, in this election. So we are not yet sure what was the, impact and what would be the legacy, but I will talk about it briefly. Okay, is it moving? Oh my God.
No, it isn't.
Okay.
Yeah. No.
So this is the focal points today. So the former part, I will talk about Shinzo Abe himself and domestic politics. And the latter part, I will briefly touch on the international relations and Shinzo Abe's contribution to that. And this sheet will show you how, Shinzo Abe was made in Japanese political world. In fact, he had really actually heavy heritage in his family. Actually, this family heritage and tradition, or any family legacy, created Shinzo Abe's politics and his own ideas and visions and actions. Kishi Nobusuke, he was the grandparent of Shinzo Abe. He became the Prime Minister of Japan in 1957, 65 years ago, and up until 60, he served as the Prime Minister And his uncle, actually Kishi's younger brother, was Eisaku Sato, a different surname, but they were brothers. And he became the prime minister in 1964, just after the Olympic year. And then 72, he resigned. And his father was Shintaro Abe, and he himself came from the political family, and his father was the chairperson of the Diet. But Shintaro Abe was also expected to become the prime minister in the future, but he suddenly passed away. But he served, as the several cabinet members, but especially he became the foreign minister in the cabinets of Nakasone in early 1980s. So those three figures really influenced on Abe's politics. But the most influential person and history was Kishi's heritage. I will go a little bit deeper into Kishi's history because it's very, very interesting to think about Shinzo Abe's politics. He was already a political figure during the wartime, and he served as a cabinet member to the war cabinet of Tojo Hideki. And then because of his importance, he became the war criminal after the defeat of Japan under the American occupation. But because of the heating Cold War in East Asia and the beginning of Korean War, Kishi was released from the prison, and he became the political leader in the Diet. And he represented actually right-wing conservative political camp. And when the conservative parties, right-wing and also liberal groups combined in 1955 and to establish the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, he became a very important leader. And then in 1957, he became the prime minister of Japan. And the most important thing Kishi did was to sign the security treaty with the United States in 1960, in spite of the strong opposition movements, especially young students' movements in 1960. So Kishi's politics really influenced grandson Shinzo Abe's way of thinking and his own agendas. And his uncle represented the decade of Japanese miracle growth, and but at the same time, he also closely linked with the security issue because United States was fighting war in Indochina and Vietnam War, and Japan was very important base for US operation. And Sato managed to sign the second security treaty with the United States in 1970. And again, it was a time of anti-Vietnam War movements worldwide and in Japan too. So it was very difficult to do it, peacefully in Japan, but Sato somehow managed to do that. So both inheritance is connected with, making Japan great again in the post-war Japan, and also making a strong ties with the United States, especially in the field of security, and also for that sake, economically too. And his father got married with Kishi's daughter. So Abe was one of the children, and Shintaro Abe was a journalist of the newspaper, Mainichi newspaper once, but anyway, he became political leader in the Diet. And he served in the Nakasone cabinet, which emphasized security again and strong ties with the United States, because Nakasone was the rather right-wing leader of the LDP camp. But Shinzo Abe wanted to, conduct the Japanese policy towards neighboring Asian countries as a strong economic power, Japan as #1 time. So Shinzo Abe used JICA or Japan Foundation or other institutions to do the ODA policy or to influence neighboring countries, including China. So these things are combined, and Abe was already thinking about it. So we can say his family represented the post-war Japanese history or even pre-war Japanese history. And Abe was really thinking about how to make Japan great again, and his strong nationalism influenced Japan and actually had been supported by Japanese audience, especially in this 21st century. So his political agendas, I will make it very brief points. I reduced to 3. Revision of constitution. Actually, LDP has a political agenda from the beginning, but they thought Article 9, which prohibit Japan to have the military, was coerced by the occupation forces. So they wanted to have their own constitution and to change the constitution to make Japan a normal country again, to have the military and to have the sovereignty to declare war. So this was the first political agenda for Abe, and he pursued, but especially after 2012, he made several steps to do that. And the next one is revision of history, and it is well known, but he was very, he stood very, very strong towards the neighboring countries, China, South Korea, North Korea, etc. And he visited Yasukuni Shrine, which had the souls of the war heroes. And he didn't say, we are very, very sorry towards the neighboring countries about the war or colonialism or especially comfort women's issues, those things. So it brought a very uncomfortable tensions in the relationship with the neighboring countries, especially in East Asia, but also sometimes with the United States or sometimes with the Australia or other Western nations. I omitted to write about the islands issue, but anyway, Senkaku Islands and those territorial issues was also a very big issues for Abe. And summing up, actually, he wanted to make Japan strong again and shining again and beautiful again in international society. So Abenomics was one of the, means to make Japan great again. So other means like national security laws or nuclear energy development, those things are combined to make Japan, to bring back great Japan again. So I skip all those things, but anyway, in 21st century, Japanese politics shifted to the right direction, right shift. And Mori, Koizumi, Abe, those people are coming from the right wing of the LDP. And Fukuda also, and Aso was not, but his idea is very close to those right-wingers. So very nationalistic politicians became the prime ministers from LDPs in 2000s. And actually they supported American war on terrors. And simultaneously, that was the time of the BRICS rising. So Mori, Koizumi, Abe, all those people thinking about India to become more friendly towards India. And in 2010s, more difficult time for all the countries in the world, global financial crisis. In Japan, East Japan, earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima nuclear plant accident, and China's rather rapid and aggressive rise. So after the Democratic Party Japan's government in 3 years, Abe succeeded, actually won the election and made the second Abe cabinet, and you know what happened. But in 2020, he had to step down because of the lots of scandals and corruption issues, but also mismanagement of pandemic and delayed Olympic game. So succeeded by Suga and now Kishida. But all those domestic politics, I can answer to the questions, but he had been a very, very strong leader, but sometimes had a whip to criticize or attack the oppositions and critical views of the media or academics. So still we have the divided views about Shinzo Abe, but internationally, actually, he was more reliable leader for the friendly countries like India. And although, this is a comment, although Abe was a strong, leader to make India, Japan closely, but this movement began before Abe became the prime minister. So Prime Minister Mori and Prime Minister Koizumi and all other prime ministers, including the DJP, actually other party, they wanted to become closer to India. So this is, I remember, I think Wadawa-san was already ambassador at that time. Our emperor and empress visited India as a official state visit in 2013, and second term of prime ministership of Shinzo Abe, he was invited by India government to attend the 65th Republic Day of India 2014. So after Prime Minister Narendra Modi established his government in 2014, both leaders worked really hard to make India-Japan global partnership realized and enriched, developed to going towards a free and open Indo-Pacific later on. So right now, because of many issues like Ukraine, Russia, China, this Indo-Pacific vision is really highly appreciated by many countries and global leaders. And Abe thought, it's absolutely necessary to have, of course, strong alliance with the United States, but also strong ties with India to for the security, but also for the prosperity, economic development, and for other global issues. So Japan could be the bridge linchpin between India and the US, Australia. So this is the famous Abe's speech at Indian Parliament in 2007. So he is now seen as one of the original planner to give the vision of Indo-Pacific because of this famous speech, and it was well received in India. So, but I think for Japanese and for Shinzo Abe too, it was very natural to see in India or South Asia as a new, bright alternative partner in Asia and global society, because in East Asia, there are lots of problems and tensions. So it's not easy to deal with China, but also between Japan and South Korea, there have been tensions prolonged in these decades. So this is a quad, which we are seeing. So legacy, we are not sure. I think Japanese are still seeing what will happen next, but Kishida and a new foreign minister, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Hayashi, belong to the different faction inside LDP. It's more economic and moderate and more America-oriented leaders. But still, Kishida is making clear that he will inherit the legacy of Shinzo Abe to some extent. So probably we are seeing LDP's action to change the constitution, but we are not sure. So we are watching as the Japanese public. So I'm sorry I took time. Thank you very much. Okay.
Not at all, Chiharu-san. You were very good on time. And it was very interesting, really, because, you've given a very kind of balanced assessment. I mean, what made Prime Minister Abe? In the sense of the history, the politics of the time, I think what Japan was going through, and you gave, the reasons as to why he had to step down while he did, and also the India-Japan, relationship, how it flowered under him. So I think that's it's been very interesting to hear you, the historical context from which he came. I think that was very, very interesting. Thank you very much. I'll now ask Professor Dr. Mukherjee to speak. And thereafter, I think there are going to be a lot of questions. So please do, focus on the foreign and the international policy, the strategic policy, but, also contextualize it just in terms of how it affected Japan itself internally.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Wada, for chairing this session, inviting me, Ambassador Kant as well, and of course to the ICS staff for the very great attention to detail in organizing this. It's also a great honor to be in the panel with Professor Takenaga, who I met many years ago when I was working on India-Japan relations, and she invited me to Rikyo to give a talk to her students. So it's wonderful to share a stage with the person from whom you've learned so much. So it's really a pleasure. So I thought I'd first start. There's a lot of overlap between what I think Professor Takenaga has said and what I would like to say, but I wanted to first start just looking broadly at Abe's legacy, across different areas, and then zoom in on the India relationship a little bit. And so first I'll just sort of talk a little bit, and then I want to show some figures of how the relationship has transformed. It's difficult to assess the impact of a single individual, obviously, when governance is such a complex act undertaken by so many different people. But the main question is, would Japan have behaved differently in the absence of Abe on the scene? And I think to that, it's very clear that, we can, when we put the question that way, we can both see how he built on the decisions of his predecessors, as Professor Takenaga has already pointed out, but also how he shifted policy and discourse in different areas and really moved Japan into a new phase of its foreign relations, I would say. And if you think about the context in which he came back into power in 2012, Japan was sort of in the slump after the Fukushima disaster. There were economic difficulties in Japan. There was political instability, the cycling through of multiple prime ministers, which also India is not, was in the 1990s, not unfamiliar with. And a sort of weak international standing, the sense of drift, that what did Japan stand for after the end of the Cold War? There was a sort of dissatisfaction in the West that Japan had not really stepped up in the first Gulf War to contribute anything significant except for financial aid. And so, Japan's standing in the world, I think, is what really he targeted, this idea that when he made that famous speech in 2012, I think, when he said Japan is back, right? And this idea that Japan had to sort of reclaim its place in the international society, as Professor Takenaga said. At the same time, he leaves, the headline, I guess, is, in terms of, if I was to sort of summarize what I want to say, is he leaves a complex legacy. It really depends on the perspective from which you evaluate him, whether it is domestic or international, whether it is status, those who favor the status quo in Japanese politics and foreign policy versus the revisionists, or whether you are dovish or hawkish on Japanese security policy. In this sense, a lot of the obituaries have described him as a polarizing figure. I think that has to be taken in the Japanese context, which is a softer way of thinking about his role in Japan. When we think of polarizing figures, you don't think of Shinzo Abe, but at the same time, within the Japanese context, he was. He did push things in many different directions. So I won't touch on the Abenomics factor since Professor Takenaga has already covered that. I think the societal stuff is a bit more interesting. As a nationalist, he obviously wanted a stronger role for Japan abroad, and that had domestic ramifications as well. He was a revisionist. He supported the revision of history textbooks in terms of how they described Japan's role in the Second World War and responsibility. He had ties to Nippon Kaigi, a revisionist nationalist organization, many of whom supplied ministers for his cabinet and so on. They're all tied to Nippon Kaigi. And he was criticized for his relationship with the media, for being sort of harsh on them when they were critical of him. And of course, the latter portion of his leadership was tainted by corruption scandals. So again, this is all very par for the course for Japanese politics. So it's not that Shinzo Abe was in that sense rather exceptional, but where he was exceptional, I think, is where you come into, and this is, I think, what Ambassador Wadhwa said in the beginning, is that from the outside, Japan's partners, I think, really saw in him a new great hope for Japan's role in Asia and beyond. And I think when you think about national security and foreign policy, that's where his major contribution comes through, at least from the perspective of other Asian countries. And so if you think about the domestic changes he brought about to try and push the discourse towards eventually accepting the revision of Article 9 of the Constitution, allowing Japan to have a quote-unquote normal military, I think that is something that is still playing out, and it remains to be seen whether that will be one of his lasting legacies, and that these 10 years of his push have actually led to a greater acceptance. Some of the public opinion data suggests that people are more open to it today than they were 10 years ago. You already mentioned he created a defense ministry, a national security council. For the first time, Japan had a national security strategy along the lines of what the US produces. And of course, he expanded hugely the role for the self-defense forces abroad. They were now allowed to sort of defend allies in military operations. They were allowed to engage in peacekeeping and other kinds of actions. And that was hugely controversial in Japan. In terms of foreign policy, I think he doubled down on the US alliance in interesting ways. He wasn't someone who was sort of seeking to make Japan independent from the US, but rather to make it a stronger partner within the US alliance. He sought a greater regional security role for Japan. And very importantly, and this comes to sort of the interpersonal relationships that drive diplomacy, he cultivated a uniquely, a good relationship with Donald Trump at a time when many other leaders around the world were struggling to sort of understand how to make sense of American politics. Abe was there, very early on and sort of understood how to deal with Trump, the businessman. And I think that helped, especially soothe the tensions during the campaign when Trump said a lot of controversial things about Japan's contribution to the US-Japan alliance and so on. So in that sense, I think he did a decent job of managing the US-Japan alliance. His relationship with China was complex. Obviously, he and his colleagues such as Taro Aso and others recognized the economic importance of China for Japan, but also I think increasingly accepted that there cannot be peaceful relations between China and Japan. And I think from the mid-2000s onwards, as the Senkaku Islands dispute kicked off, you start to see a change in the discourse and the way, and it reflects in policy as well under Shinzo Abe later on from sort of both in his early tenure 2006, but also then from 2012. And he was also a very strong supporter of Taiwan, which is something that many others have obviously observed, that he had family history in terms of his grandfather and so on supporting Taiwan, but also he himself was described as a great friend of Taiwan. And so when you hear about Japan today saying that, quite remarkably saying that Japan will consider coming to the aid of Taiwan in a crisis, it has some sort of lineage and origins in Abe's own, the way he sort of change the discourse within the LDP, at least in his faction, but also even among the moderates to some extent. And there again, legacy plays a role, just as Abe was a senior cabinet official with Koizumi and Mori, their administrations. Suga and Kishida were senior officials in his cabinet. So there is continuity in Japanese policy, and it's important to also think about how he is embedded. Abe himself was embedded in a longer history of a reorientation of Japanese policy, right? We shouldn't risk overemphasizing just how much he himself shifted. I think he took, I think Dr. Jayashankar's point about the pace, I think he accelerated things that were already in play. And I think it's important to think of it in those terms. He was also very active in Southeast Asia. He sort of traveled extensively in the region. He met all the leaders. Japan sort of fulfilled its long desire to sort of become a regional order provider, foreign aid, infrastructure investment. A lot of activity happened around there around those issues. And Japan consistently described Southeast Asia as the central pillar of the Indo-Pacific, and actually meant it, and actually put its money where its mouth was. In the region, it's already been mentioned, he sort of was the first to bring the idea of the Indo-Pacific into high-level leadership political discourse. It was, of course, there before in think tank circles, but he sort of mentioned it in his speech in 2007, and then introduced the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific in 2016. He also was a great champion of the Quad, as we know. He was the first Japanese PM to address both houses of the Indian and Australian parliaments, as well as both houses of the US Congress, right? So it's really quite an achievement for him, for a Japanese leader, to have done all that in this period of time. And I guess the dark spots or the weak spots in his legacy, I think, might be in the foreign policy area. I think would be Japan's relationship with Korea. I think there, the consistent denial of the comfort women issue, despite the sort of agreement to pay reparations, it sort of cast a shadow. And then, in response to the Supreme Court of Korea ruling in 2019 that held Japanese companies liable for a very small sum of money, it was $89,000 or something, but really the symbolic importance of that, Abe was unwilling to let it go, and Japan, in a sense, retaliated with its own trade export controls on Korea, which is a dispute that is still going on, right? So, in some sense, one might argue that he left Japan, ROK, Korea relations weaker or less better than he found them. But on all other fronts, I think he can be recognized as a fairly transformational figure. I have some on the India relationship. I have some quick figures that I want to share with you all to show, in a sense, the timelines along which we're talking about how rapidly India-Japan relations have improved, but also how they precede Abe in a way. I mean, I think we can see that this sort of starts at the turn of the century, and there's a sort of movement there after the nuclear test of 1998, when Japan starts to really engage with India, partly because the US is engaging with India, and Japan is very comfortable operating within the US alliance system. So long as US-India relations are improving, Japan-India relations improve on the back of that, or in connection with that. So this is a picture on trade, huge improvements since the 2000s. The same story is in FDI. Around sort of early 2000s, you see a massive uptick. This is the annual stock of FDI, Japanese FDI in India from 96 to 2020, huge increases. Official aid to India after 2004, when India reorganized its aid policy and limited the number of countries that could donate or give foreign aid to India. Japan sort of, again, really stepped in. Of course, a huge majority of these are concessional loans. These are not grants. So India is sort of getting concessional loans from Japan rather than taking strictly grant aid. VIP visits from Japan. Here you can actually see Abe's impact from 2012. You see a substantial, I mean, it was high, again, in a sense, when he was prime minister in 06, 07, you see that spike, and then you see it again in 2012, right? So VIP visits from Japan to India, 1980 to 2019. He really took it up several notches in some sense. Joint military exercises, 2001 to 2016. Again, you see, fairly one exercise a year, most of the time until sort of 2012, and then you see this increase to 3, 6, 7 in 2016. The data doesn't go beyond that, but at least in this data set. So you see this increase of sort of strategic interaction between India and Japan. This is, how often India is mentioned in the East Asian Strategic Review, which is the sort of NIDS, this important think tank of the Ministry of Defense in Japan, their annual report. And so you can see that over time, again, after the bottom blue trend line, after 2012, you see India's mentions go up, right? So there's a sense in which the government is indicating that India is a priority for Japan. This has all been covered, so I'm not going to really belabor these points. I think most important thing to say here is that, as Professor Takanaka pointed out, there is a history behind Shinzo Abe's relationship with Japan, which was, started by Prime Minister Mori and Prime Minister Vajpayee. And then under Abe, I think it really also it accelerates in some ways. And there are all these important agreements on defense, classified information, nuclear energy. Remarkably, the nuclear energy agreement allows there is no sort of nullification clause that if India tests again, it's not clear that the agreement will automatically expire. India is also not a member of the NPT, but Japan, makes a huge exception for India in this case. And I think these are important things to observe about the special place that India holds for Abe during this period. They developed the 2+2 dialogue at ministerial level, and most recently there was a logistics agreement. There's multilateral relationship building here as well. There's the first time the Quad meets in 2007. He also gives his famous speech on the Indo-Pacific then. There's the trilateral. So you can see the increasingly dense web of relationships that are emerging between these four countries. Japan, Australia, India have their own trilateral at the vice minister level in 2015. And finally, Japan returns to the Malabar exercise after being excluded for a while when it takes place in India. And then, of course, the Quad, again, Professor Takanaka has talked about this. I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A. He was also really the person that sort of brought Trump to the idea of the FOIP and the Quad, and to sort of say that on the sidelines of the Manila summit in 2017, that they should reinvigorate this structure. And eventually it grew into a Quad Plus that also includes other countries on an issue-based basis. So why does all of this happen? I think you can see around the same time that Japan's relationship with India grows, you see the growing gap between Chinese defense spending and Japanese defense spending, right? So Japan's historically sort of had the cap on its defense spending, but China just takes off in the early 2000s. And so Japan's security environment is getting worse and worse over time. And this is the primary driver really of a lot of this. I'll skip over this, but if you look at the these are the number of times Japan has to scramble fighter jets to sort of warn off other countries' jets that have entered its airspace, right? And here again, you see around 2000 or thereafter, really 2005, as the Senkaku dispute takes off, the number of incursions, the number of scrambles that Japan has to do to warn off foreign aircraft really spikes, right? Again, Japan's security environment is getting worse. So you can see the share here, the blue color over time. The share of Chinese aircraft in these incursions is going up and up, right? The share of other countries, especially Russia, is declining. And really it's China now that Japan has to worry about in the course of the 2010s as it becomes more and more assertive in its region. This is a very complicated graph, as all Japanese official graphs are. But the idea is, again, you see in 2012, there's a massive takeoff in the number of vessels in Japan's territorial waters. Again, this is not unusual. There can be innocent passage according to international law, but the number of Chinese vessels around the Senkakus has increased substantially. All this to show that, in a sense, Japan's security environment is deteriorating. Japan has to also worry about North Korea. And so the motivations for Japan are really, in a sense, China's rise, but also worries about American commitment to East Asia. And so India becomes a fairly reliable partner because India has its own problems with China. US-India relations are improving dramatically during this period. So that's really the broader context. And then Abe is part of a group of sort of revisionist conservatives in his party who talk the language of value-oriented diplomacy. They think that this arc of freedom and prosperity in Asia is really what's in the Indo-Pacific is really what can challenge China. Now, whether they really genuinely believe that or whether it's a nice set of words to use to kind of create a coalition is a very debatable thing. And Japanese analysts have debated it for a long time. But finally, another main point here is that, if it was security challenges and democratic values that united Japan with other countries, Korea would be a great candidate. But they cannot do that because of historical baggage. And I think the reason India becomes so important is because India and Japan share very little history, almost no historical baggage. If anything, Abe is quite positive on India's early role in sort of normalizing Japan's place in the international community after the Second World War. And he has, spoken in glowing terms of Subhash Chandra Bose and Radha Vinod Pal and other Indian figures who sort of sought to move past Japan's role in the Second World War. So in a sense, there was a meeting of Abe's domestic agenda with his foreign policy agenda when it came to India, and it allowed him to really build a very strong relationship. I'll very quickly, I'll leave out the India part because we can, I think the audience knows that very well. Just a conclusion, I think, going forward, what can we expect from this relationship? And I think after Abe, you see the continuity because obviously the prime ministers are deeply steeped in, Kishida himself was the foreign minister for 5 years under Abe. And so there is this sense of continuity, but I think the relationship is much more regionalized. Now, India and Japan are looking at themselves as regional order providers. They are more embedded in the Quad. Whether they can actually pull it off is a wholly different question, but this is at least, I think, how they see themselves now. And there's deeper economic cooperation between the two countries, particularly with Japan investing in Indian infrastructure. Prime Minister Kishida just announced a massive infrastructure package, just like Abe had done in 2014. And looking forward, I think these are some areas that we should think about observing to see how the relationship improves. Is Japan able to actually transfer defense technology to India and co-produce with India? This is a big question. The US-2 Shinmewa aircraft, India, it's a running joke now in India-Japan relations that this thing has never taken off, literally, for India. So, that's something that to watch. Whether joint patrols are on the cards. I mean, Japan does this in the South China Sea sometimes with the Americans. India obviously does patrols in the Indian Ocean. Would India and Japan do joint patrols in some sense through the Indo-Pacific region? And then economic competition with the BRI, right? This idea of high quality infrastructure, again, an idea that Abe championed through the Quad. Can the Quad countries use the Build Back Better initiative of the G7, but also the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor? Can they use that to compete with China to offer better quality infrastructure to countries in the region? Perhaps not cheaper, but better quality. So in a sense, these are all the legacies of his time, and these are things to watch going forward. I'll stop here and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rohan. I mean, you really managed to cover so much in this very brief time, and it's really interesting because, I mean, fundamentally, yes, Abe changed the discourse in many, many areas. I think that's really been what was which all of us feel, and that his statement that Japan is back, I think that was a focus right through the time that he was there. In foreign policy, it was really again a mixed bag. And you talked about the relations with South Korea. I think this is one area where really relations went southwards while he was there. And two of the regrets that he had when he stepped down, he mentioned one was, of course, not being able to revise Article 9 of the Constitution. But the other one, he said, was relations with Russia. And I wonder what he thought about, I mean, I always thought, was he prime minister? Would Japan's position on Ukraine have been as it is now? I mean, it is, I think, rather extreme maybe to us, as it seems, but would it have been the same? So, there was that. And of course, you talk about the India relationship and that there were so many complementarities and politically, economically, and so on. And I think there was also a belief that he had in the relationship and much of his legacy. I recall one thing that, he was very, very clear right through and he was very insistent on being a regular part of the Malabar exercises. So, we would call them off and on once in a way Japan would join. But I remember the insistence and finally, of course, we did agree that Japan would be a regular part of the Malabar. So I think that he did see the strategic advantage also, really, of being, as you call it, order providers in the Indo-Pacific, Japan and India being order providers in the Indo-Pacific. So thank you so much. We've had two really wonderful presentations, and now the floor is open for questions. How do I go about it? I think I would need some help from
Yes,
you.
ma'am.
Yeah.
So right now we have one question in the chat box from Ms.
Okay.
Yukti Pawar. Should I read out the question?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So first of all, she thanks you all for the presentations, and she says, I want to ask about the way China has reacted to Shinzo Abe's assassination, with netizens celebrating his death. How are the Japanese people and government reacting to this? And what does it reflect about Japan-China relations?
Is it addressed? Because it'd be nice if it's addressed specifically to either one of our speakers, or maybe both could answer it.
It's not addressed to anyone.
Okay.
So
Haru-san, what do you feel about it? Since you are there in Japan, what was the feeling in Japan about this reaction of netizens, as it said? Yeah.
I think very positive remarks about Abe's achievement came from, for example, the United States or Europe or Australia, etc. But it's polemish to see how South Korea or China react to Abe's demise. And in fact, the negative legacy of Abe's time, or beyond Abe, actually, right-wing politics in Japan in 1990s and in this century, is, China was a friend of Japan up until China was receiving huge ODA, and China was still necessary to get the Japanese economic financial support for her development, for its development. But after China achieved the status of big economy, and especially it became the second largest economy in the world, 2010. Actually, China actually had been changing that to Japan, and also Japan was reacting to China too. So in these 2 decades, Japanese attitude toward China has been really hardened. And even in 2000, it was said that politically cold, but economically hot. But right now, actually, economy is also really at the edge because of US-China tension, and lots of things happen. So Xi Jinping's policy is very hard. So among Japanese opinion makers and intellectuals, journalists or politicians, anti-China attitudes are really, really strong, really strong. And that's really annoying. Probably we should find a way to do something about it. But one of the reasons is China's really strong, hard policy toward Japan too, and including the civil society in China too. But so, for example, the issue of Hong Kong is very, getting the attention in Japanese society, not in the same way of the United States, but in Japan, and Taiwan issue also, getting really attention in Japan too. So, yeah, it's very, very difficult.
So I think positions are hardening on both sides.
Yes,
of course, there was an official reaction of China, and then there was the netizens. Rohan, how do you respond to the?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of work on how the Chinese state sort of, rides this tiger of nationalism, and how they sort of instigate these protests against other countries, and then it sort of becomes a bit out of control. It's happened in the past with regard to, Abe's visits to the Yasukuni Shrine, for example. So I think, the Chinese state probably will also curb that to some extent, if they can, because at this moment, China has a lot going on all fronts, and I think there may be a desire to sort of not stoke that particular relationship too much in a negative direction. I don't think the Japanese public really takes that seriously, what is being said. That's my impression. Of course, I think, as Professor Takanaga said, there are lots of leaders who politically benefit in Japan, who politically benefit from being anti-China. But I don't necessarily think that this will affect policy, as it were. I think it's just sort of disregarded as noise in some sense, what happens on Weibo or other places.
Right, and this whole thing which has been a long-term thing of cold politics and hot economics, because I think despite the efforts after COVID. I mean, there really hasn't been so much of diversification of production or, onshoring as one would have expected. So I think that is, that is something. The economic relationship is just far too intense, and to be able to really disengage. And yeah.
Same for India. I mean, in India, China trade is at historic highs at this point. It's hard to engage.
Ma'am, we have two more questions in the chat box. So will you take them one by one, or should I?
Yeah, you could take them both together, and then we will ask, I think in the interest of time, that, both our panelists speak to them.
Sure. So this question is for both speakers. How did Shinzo Abe reconcile his initiation and strong support of the Quad with the position of Southeast Asian states, which were predominantly not in favor of what the Quad stood for, that is containing China? The next question is from Ambassador Kanta. He asks Professor Takenaka, how do you see the prospects for Japan's emergence as a normal country, including through amendment to Article 9? To what extent Abe-san's domestic legacy and impact outlast his demise? Thank you.
Could I just, Shruti, add one question more to Professor Takenaka and to Rohan? How will the factions of the LDP play out? Because, Prime Minister Abe was a strong man. Even after he stepped down, one felt that, he was there behind the scenes in both the elections of Prime Minister Suga and in Prime Minister Kishida. Do you think that there's going to be, it's going to affect the LDP factions? Is there going to emerge a really strong leader? Will his, will this vacuum be filled?
Okay. Right.
So, Chiharu-san.
Okay, about Southeast Asia, actually Abe wanted to regain the Japanese big influence in Southeast Asia in his terms, even in 2000 and also 2010s. So for example, using JICA or using Japan Foundation or other policies, of course, security-wise, but also economically, and also, raising human, education, human resources, etc. But still, Southeast Asia is like the stage of different countries, and some of them are very close to China, but some of them are not very close to China. And democracy is changing their government, and the Vietnamese do not like China very much, separatory islands, and those things, so Myanmar, political turmoil, Philippines, change of the government. So anyway, Southeast Asia is not one at all. So it's between China, India, Japan, United States, Australia. So I think Abe didn't succeed to make a big influence of Japan in spite of his efforts to do that. And about Abe's legacy domestically, thank you very much for the question, Ambassador Kanta. And it's related to the question of Adwa-san about LDP and factions, etc. And probably we are not sure what we will do, Kishida. He will do the state funeral on 27th of September, and he is saying that he will inherit the Abe's policy to some extent, to large extent, but we are not. Kishida and Abe has been, in a way, big rivals in the LDP. And Kishida comes from Hiroshima, so he is more concerned about nuclear policy. And Kishida was a child in New York City when, elementary school, etc. So he's more pro-American liberal, tradition. So his combination with Biden is very, very good. And Foreign Minister Hayashi was also, studied at Kennedy School, Boston, Harvard, Boston. So he is more liberal America. So I think Kishida government will choose a kind of different way of Abe-Suga line. And in fact, what will happen to the Abe faction will be the big issue, because it's a big group, but Abe doesn't have a son, and his cousin Kishi is not very strong political leader, although he is in the defense minister right now. So we are not sure what will happen to, who will succeed the Abe faction in a big one, right wing, and they can fight each other to split the factions. So we are not sure what will happen to the LDP and what will happen to the right grouping inside the LDP or outside LDP. And additionally, actually, the assassin, actually, the man who killed Abe was really, thinking about his mother's contribution to the, how to call it, Unification World Churches group. And actually, Kishi and Sato Abe, all those groups are really combined with this religious group because it was against communism in South Korea. So anyway, anti-communist strategy and religious group. And this man was really angry about this organization. And also because Abe's strong tie with this group, he killed the ex-prime minister. So these things will come out. Yeah, these things will come. So we are not sure what will happen, So it's not a beautifully straight line of Abe's legacy. So we will see lots of things will happen even before the state funeral. So it will become a big issue. So I don't know whether I could answer, but thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yoru-san. Rohan?
Thank you. To Professor Alatas's question, I think that part of it was to sort of soften what the Quad was. I think he was willing to sort of make compromises, and he actually, India played a role in that to say that it shouldn't just be the free and open Indo-Pacific; it should be the free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And I think Abe was very receptive to that idea, and he and Trump sort of changed the rhetoric coming out of their capitals on this particular issue, because it was evident that Southeast Asia was very deeply uncomfortable with the return of great power competition. At the same time, Japan has invested a great deal in the region, and I think not quite to buy support, but to be seen as an alternative to China, and a credible alternative that is present and does not abandon or create instability. I think in that it is also an alternative to the United States from the perspective of Southeast Asian countries that see both China and the US as sources of instability. And that's why they often turn to India and Japan and Australia as more regionally stable actors in some sense. So he played on that. Of course, the Quad since then has also been diluted. It's not clear that the Quad itself knows what it stands for anymore, but that's a separate conversation. Ambassador Kant, it may very well be, I think, that relations may improve with Korea in the short term because Abe was particularly tainted by his relationship with Park Geun-hye. So in a sense that, she was such a toxic politician and he developed, this is the downside of sort of personality-based politics. And it worked really well for him and Narendra Modi. It didn't work so well in the Korean case because when the other party becomes radioactive in politics, you tend to then be associated with them. But it's also remarkable because it takes two hands to clap. It's remarkable that South Korean public opinion surveys see Japan as a greater threat consistently than North Korea. And that really says something about the historical animosities that are so deeply rooted in the region that, even an apology at this point may not necessarily stamp that out to the point where a common cause in the face of a rising China might actually take place. So those are such deep issues that it's very hard, they're so tied into national identity that it's very hard to think that it'll go so far in the direction that they might actually become strong allies. So I'm not very pessimistic I'm not very optimistic about the long-term Japan ROK in that sense. Yeah, I think those are the two questions.
Rohan, any ideas on what you think about the factional thing within the LDP? The factions were fairly weakened before, and they've come back to the fore in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think Professor Takanaka is the expert on this, so I don't want to, but I do agree with her that this incident of as we learn more about why he was assassinated and the person what the affiliations of the person were, there may be a turn away from these groups in Japanese politics and society that leads to further weakening in some or a re-weakening of them to some extent. Prime Minister Kishida is himself a moderate and may want to keep them in check as well. So, yeah, I think we can expect a more moderate, yet, I think external pressures will still continue to drive Japan's security policy. Domestic policies will be a different story.
Yeah, different story. Even I don't understand very well. But many people, many politicians think, I could be the successor of Abe. So that's now going on, on the stage.
Interesting to have multiple leaders. I think that's also not too bad. People.
And the
I
question
think Vice
about,
Admiral, sorry.
just a question about China in the Pacific. I think, Abe's strategy was really, advanced, in advance, in many ways. But it's interesting, his political ideas are, rooted in the really old days, but also his vision about international strategy was really advanced in a way. So actually, China is going into the Pacific with the Belt and Road Initiative, but unlike Quad, unlike the United States, which have lots of security treaties, alliances with other countries, China actually stands alone. Actually, China doesn't have security treaty with other countries up until now. So now we are seeing what will happen economically in China and how China can overcome the isolation of pandemic strategy. So anyway, it's not like China is becoming bigger and bigger and depressed the United States in the world, or especially in the Pacific. So maybe diplomatically or strategically, we should be a little bit calm down to see China. Avoid the chaotic
better phase in Japan's relations. I think Vice Admiral Muralidharan had a question too. Have you put up a question? I think you're muted.
I have put up. My basic question was to both speakers. It's taking on from the Quad. With China now trying to get into the Pacific Islands, with Solomon Islands and the others, they're trying to get more and more into it, which could, in the long run, become again a threat to the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific. It is something that even the US has reacted, the others. So actually, Prime Minister Abe's, having the Quad with 4 nations on all 4 quadrants of the Indo-Pacific, don't you think that is actually sort of prophetic? They're trying to get more into it, and this is something that we need to watch out for. That was my question.
Rohan, maybe you can take that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The Quad can be many things. I think it's still sorting out what it is. I think the vaccine initiative has not really gone anywhere. The supply chain decoupling has also not really taken off despite the announcement of various initiatives. So I think it's too early to tell, but I think as far as his vision was concerned, as Professor Dagna already said, he was prophetic. I think he saw the importance of 4 democratic major powers sort of creating alternatives to a Sino-centric order in the Indo-Pacific. And for that, there needs to be, of course, better coordination between the 4 capitals, and often priorities tend to vary because India is not a treaty ally of the United States. But I think, in its own way, the Quad will continue to evolve in these interesting directions. And I'm sure people in these capitals are taking great note of what's happening in the Pacific Islands. I know Australians are, for sure, paying attention.
So thank you. I think with that, we've kind of come to the time allotted to us. It's been very interesting. We've had really excellent presentations. It's very insightful, so it will be very interesting. And, without a doubt, Prime Minister Abe has left a legacy, and a lot of it will continue because, it had already kind of reached a level of maturity in terms of the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, and so on. So we will see more of that. Of course, will we see some of these strengthened or weakened in the time to come? You talk about the relationship with China, Chiharu-san. The other thing is, of course, the India-Japan relationship. And what is interesting is Rohan spoke about personality politics. I think there is in India-Japan relations what one has seen over time, and one saw different governments saw the DPJ in Japan and of course we've had, the UPA and the NDA here, is that there is on both sides, I think, a bipartisan support to strengthening this relationship. So I think personalities will come and personalities will go. I mean, the term in Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, for example, was an extremely respected figure in Japan and for Prime Minister Abe, and so is Prime Minister Modi. So I hope, a bilateral relationship will continue as a result in many ways of the legacy, but also because it has a strength of its own. So thank you again to Dr. Mukherjee. Thank you again to Professor Takanaka. And thank you for everybody at the ICS putting this together, and all the